Welcome back, everybody. This is not an update on the state of the Malazan Empire because it doesn't exist yet. Nope. This is more about Geralt Galain. I'm talking about Forge of Darkness, the Karkanas trilogy. I'm finally starting it. Well, it's only 2 books so far, but we'll see. I'm finally started reading Forge of Darkness, and I'm super excited. So I figured I'll do the same as I did for the Malazan Book of the Fallen and just ramble about my experiences like daily. So yeah, there's that, and let's do it, I guess. Cheers. That was underwhelming. Anyway, cheers. All right. So this will obviously be different from the Malazan Book of the Fallen read through thing that I did because yeah, I haven't read this one before, so I am figuring shit out as I go along. So I'll probably get things wrong all the time. But maybe, we can figure this whole thing out together. So that's sort of what I'm trying to do here and what I'm aiming for. So yeah, let's get started. I've read the prologue. Not the prologue, is it? The prelude, basically, and that's where we find out that blind Galan lies, and I have living proof for that. As you can see on my nose with that scar, Galan says a blind man doesn't rush. He carefully checks his way. No, blind men do rush, and then they run into shit, and then they bust their noses. Anyway, so what we see here is like the framing for the story, that being blind Galan, whom we've heard about before. At least people who have read the Malazan Book of the Fallen have heard about him. Blind Galan is telling the story of whatever happened in Corel Galain to everyone's favorite murderous bard, Fisher Keltath. That's sort of the frame narrative for this one, which once again, straight up, we get like Erikson makes it clear that this will be a very unreliable story, and that prelude, that ramble thing that Galan does at the beginning, makes that very clear, in a way. Oh yeah, by the way, this will obviously be kind of full spoiler Malazan Book of the Fallen, because yeah, I assume that when you're reading Karkanas, you have read the other Malazan Book of the Fallen stuff, and possibly also the novels of the Malazan Empire. But since it's been like ages since I read them, I probably won't get all the connections there because yeah, it's been like 4 or 5 years since I last read the novels of the Malazan Empire. So yeah, we have that opening thing which frames the story and talks a lot about certainty and truth or not truth in history. The idea that history is made up mostly. I mean, that's like a truism that I guess everyone who's heard me ramble for a while knows that I totally subscribe to that. It's like when you study history, you also notice that yeah, most of it, there's very few facts that we can actually pin down and everything. So that plays a role there. The other thing that we learn in there is that conviction is an important theme and where it will lead people. Convictions, and I really like that way that conviction is a hard fist. Maybe yeah, that's true. When we as people are like have convictions, we usually tend to follow them, or they tend to drive us in specific directions, and that can be very problematic. It can also be very good, but it can have dire consequences. So yeah, and then we start with chapter 1, and the first thing I noticed is a similarity to Gardens of the Moon. Right when we start the Malazan Book of the Fall, it obviously also ends with that, but we start with that description of the weather vane up on Moxhold, And the Critical Dragon AP Canavan has made like this long analysis of just this opening paragraph of that weather vane. That's pretty cool. Go watch it. And here we start with a description of that door frame over Dracona's house, right? Where it is written, "There will be peace." And that's sort of where this whole thing, that whole first chapter unfolds from. And I just found this like interesting that we once again we have that clear like a very detailed description of that lintel stone and the Zathonai script in it, and how it is both like brutal and so forth. Yeah, a brutal attack on the stone to write something in it and everything like that, which really cool. Contrasts nicely with that statement of "there will be peace." Another thing that I noticed is, once again, this chapter is sort of elliptical because we end the chapter also with that whole idea of like "there will be peace" and what that means and so forth. So I really enjoyed that. The next thing is the pace is much slower. Like the prose it flows much more nobly in a way. I mean, so far at least, we don't have the whole like even when we have those border swords, they don't speak like Malazan Marines. They don't curse that much, I guess. They yeah, it all feels more legendary, which kind of makes sense because it's like so many millennia in the past and everything. But it has more of this like, I don't want to say these Tolkien-esque like atmosphere to it, because obviously that's not the case, and I don't want to do anything of like comparing it to the Silmarillion or whatever. That's not what it is. But it has a more medieval feel to it. And that's like the next thing that I noticed. I think I said that at some point in one of the Malazan Book of the Fallen stuff. There is very little what you might call like classic pseudo-European, pseudo-medieval fantasy happening in the Malazan Book of the Fall. I know there's a bit more in Esselman's writing because places like Unter and parts of like Quantali, basically of that continent, are more medieval, feudalistic in nature. There's more of it happening in Path to Ascendancy as well, I know. But in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, in Steven Erikson's writing, we encounter very, very little, almost no like typical medieval fantasy places or anything like that, if that makes sense. Maybe Malaz Island, but it feels more like this pirate place. But that's, I guess, the closest we ever get to like a city with like a castle and everything. So I found it quite interesting to see that shift now, because this is a story about feudalism. You have these noble houses, you have they all have their holds and everything. I mean, yes, you have noble houses and conflicts between noble houses in Darujistan, but once again, most of that we'll learn about in Orb Scepter Throne by Esselman, not Steven Erikson's writing. Like this, like the house stuff does obviously come up in Toll the Hounds, but so I found that interesting because this seems to be exactly that story, or it starts out as exactly that story. In Corel Galain, you have noble houses. There is intrigue between them. They are looking for, like, there's a brewing conflict. It feels much more because also you have like these noble houses actually have like land, and there's people working on them. I don't even know if they're like endangered or whatever. That we're not that far, but it feels more like a feudal society as compared to whatever the Malazan Empire is as a society, or Lether or whatever we see in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. So it feels more medieval in a way, and I enjoyed that. It's cool. I mean, not much plot has happened. We basically see that there's some kind of quest thing starting, like Draconas is going to the Azathanai, whoever they may be. Azathani. Yeah, I'm struggling with pronunciations. Also, this is the first time like I read then I listening to Karkanas, and that's the first time someone like a narrator is actually calling them Teist and not Tist, which something. So I'll call him Teist from now on, which kind of makes sense. So yeah, Draconos is going to visit the Azathanai. He has a unacknowledged son who has some kind of mother, and no one knows who so far. Erethan, something like that. I'm still learning names and shit. So yeah, we'll see where that is going. We then spend an inordinate amount of time looking at horses. And once again, I personally love horses. I guess some of you may know that I love horses. I've done a lot of horse riding in my day, actually on Friday as well. But so I love horses, and what I really appreciate about Steven Erikson writing about horses is how good he is at it. Like, he gets it right. It's not just like when you read a lot of fantasy, it's like, oh, this noble steed, and that's sort of about it. Steven Erikson writes about horses like someone who knows about horses, who has dealt with horses at least somewhat. And all this description about, and this is like the other bit there, right? It's Steven Erikson, everything is also can be read on several levels. So when we have that discussion or like the training of that new horse, war horse, and the idea that like horses in general are like frightened, and you break them, then they trust and so forth. It kind of can be seen as a metaphor, both of them, because that's why they go through that together, right? You have that mare and Erethain. I probably speak. I forgot. It's probably not the right name. But anyway, so they train together, and when we see him at the beginning, he's super frightened and gnawing on his fingers and shit like that. And they train together, and they build that kind of trust. It goes both ways. It's not just the horse that gets broken and trained. It's also the boy. We also meet, well, not really meet, but envy, spite, and they have a third sister called Malice. So it will be interesting to see where that was going. I feel like one of the fun things of this book so far is like, how many characters do I meet that end up in Dragnipur? That's sort of the game that I'm playing at some point, which comes later when we meet Kataspala, for example. But another thing that I find very interesting is the tutor, the scholar, and I see some kind of. This is interesting later on, but we'll talk about it in a minute. I see like his look at like him being like this old man, but also like he thinks very highly of him and thinks very badly of Erethan, if that is his name. God, and I this idea of having to form and force the like a young person into something that they maybe don't even want to be is something that we'll see a lot going forward. I feel we also see it with Osirk, obviously. Osirk, however you pronounce him, and his like soldier buddy who wants to form it into a soldier, whether he wants or not. So yeah, there's that. I mean, there's so much. I guess I'm probably missing most of it because I read it yesterday and then I couldn't record the video because the camera overheated. So I'm doing this in the morning now. Not a smart idea. Anyway, so I feel that I'll have more to say on that later. But I already like how, with like these very few thoughts and so forth, we already see how good like Erikson is at establishing characters in this series so far. I feel I mean, he did that obviously also with the Malazan Book of the Fallen, but I feel with this one, it's all just a bit clearer, crisper in a way. It's like, yeah. I mean, I remember Erikson has said at some point that he has that with Karkanas he actually knew what he was doing, and on a understood better what he was doing with Malazan writing. So that kind of makes sense, I guess. Or I'm projecting it in here. Um, anyway, let's look at the other chapter, chapter 2, and then make some maybe comparisons and shit. Chapter 2 shows us other houses. We've met like the Drakenhome or whatever it's called, the Draconis' house, and we have now meet several different ones. We meet that house of Osirks. I've already forgotten the name of that house. Anyway, there's a bunch of houses going on, and there we see how the patriarch of the family, the old man, gets painted by Kadaspala, of all people, whom we've met in Toll the Hounds, in something of a bad state back then. But we already see there is a lot of madness in him already, and he's a very devoted artist and has a slightly problematic relationship to his sister, just maybe. We'll see about that. And then we obviously see all of that through mostly at this point also that old soldier and buddy of young Osirks, which will lead to problems because he wants young Osirk to take over the army and then force out Draconis. So we already see how different houses are looking towards this civil war in a way. This is something that is interesting. This idea that a society is heading towards a conflict. Everyone knows they're heading that way, but not everyone is preparing for that whole thing, but no one actually yet dares to say it in a way. This feeling of foreboding is very, very strong here. So there's that. And I find this interesting. So we have basically two young men that have mentor, teacher, whatever, friend kind of figures that are not as much friends as they might seem because they have ulterior motives and want to push them in a specific direction. So we'll see how that parallel goes out. I really enjoyed that part with Kadaspala and the old man, whose name I have forgotten. I will probably, hopefully, learn it at some point. When they're sitting and drinking wine and talking about art and art appreciation and criticism, that conversation I really enjoyed. It's I've read a lot of philosophy in my day. I've read a lot of Plato's dialogues and stuff like that, or Hume's dialogue. So you have that point where where people sit down and you have a philosophical argument, and it's written by one person. But to better explain and work out their philosophical argument, they create that fictitious dialogue. And the discussion of Kadaspala and that other dude, Osirk's father, about government on the one hand and art criticism on the other hand is very, very, very interesting to me. And it feels a bit like that. It also, the idea that art criticism is about how to put down people who like stuff and so forth. There is a lot to it. There's also a lot of bitterness in there. Yeah. It kind of goes, once again, that idea that it is very much about power, about taking away power, about take control. That criticism is about, and art criticism is about control. There's something there. I sense a strong frustration of the author with literary criticism there in the background, but still, to compare it now to ideas of government and justice that Osirk's father is looking at. So it's I guess it's for Cruel as Sail, or their forerunners that war was about. I still need to learn all those words, and I suck at that kind of thing, but I promise I'll get better in future videos. Anyway, so that's like an interesting discussion there on government and laws being about a negotiation of which violence is permissible to for the for the price of the greater good, I guess, in a way. We can have us a discussion on that at some point as well. Um, yeah, we then switch to that idea of growing up, the idea of hostages. Once again, the idea of hostages also adds to that medieval feudalistic feel that I mentioned earlier, because it's the concept of noble hostages is something that you have a lot in medieval society as well. It's like and the way it is done here is with Krill Durav. So obviously, House Durav is pretty cool as well. I mean, I recognize that name, and him having all these mixed feelings about family in a way. Once again, we see that yeah, he's obviously been fostered and hostaged in the house of Kataspala, and his sister, who, as we already know from Toll the Hounds, is going to marry Anamander Rake's brother Andarist. And that's sort of like the third bit. Again, the interesting thing that I found here is that throughout these first chapters, we already see that Teist society is already at that point, and this one of the things that I found like really interesting in my last reread of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, right? This emphasis on ecological destruction of like overhunting and environmental destruction basically. And we see that here again. It's like you have these people. Everyone is complaining about all these animals that can no longer be hunted because they're dead, and like forests being cut down and so forth. So we see that theme once again pop up here already, but with less rage than in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, at least for now. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that because Krill says he goes out to look for those dead animals. Obviously he just wants to get out because of like the emotional stress and shit like that, but And yeah, then we see the three brothers there. Silchas Ruin, Andarist, and Anamander Rake. And what I really found interesting already about this first chapter, like now it's chapter 2, but still the first encounter we have there. Silchas Ruin, best boy. Now what I found interesting is like you see Silchas Ruin in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, in Midnight Tides and Reaper's Gale, mostly Reaper's Gale obviously, and a bit later as this super doer dude, because well yeah, he spent like a couple of thousand years after being murdered or like stabbed in the back, a couple of thousand years in the ground, so I get his point. But he's so happy, like he's more of this like he's always laughing and more of a easygoing person in the company of Andarist and Anamander Rake there. And it's like, yeah, I want to break open that tomb to see what's written on the inside. Just because, right? It's like, just because. And then he doesn't, obviously, but yeah. So there's that. And yeah. I like that the first time we see those three, we see them through the eyes of his Shtula, whoever she is. She sounds very interesting. I'm very much looking forward to figuring out more about her, because I like this idea. Because right at the beginning, it's one of those points where we question like conventional ideas of gender roles and sexuality with her, because she's taken a lot of lovers, and people are like dismissing her for that at this point in a way. And this is a huge problem, because we tend to do the same in our society a lot more. Like, I don't need to talk about that, right? But like, obviously it's something that is like rather in like more misogynist circles. It's very much something that you blame women for, but never men. But there we always tend to then go and how to say call it yeah, they're easy to get or whatever, and it's terrible to talk that way because you know what, emotions are weird, and sometimes we just fall in love with people a lot and fast and easy. That just happens, but that doesn't devalue the act of falling in love or giving away your heart or whatever you want to call it. And I feel that's once again one of these ideas where we like see things in a transactional way and have this weird idea that things are worth more if they cost more, which may be, you know, in like physical matters up to a certain point that may be the case, but with actual, you know, with achievements in life or emotions, that's bullshit. That's something that pisses me off no end. When people's like, yeah, but you didn't pay hard enough to actually earn that. It's like, fuck that. It's not about earning. And the same way, on the other hand, is with falling in love. It's like, it's it's not. It will still hurt no matter how many times this shit happens. It is still worth exactly the same thing. So I'm very much looking forward into to figuring out more about her and how things are going there. And then we come to that Hearthstone scene. Like, I really appreciate how Erikson does slowly introduce these ideas. So we already know that there's Thais language and Thais script. There's also the Azathanai, however to pronounce that, script of those people whom we have not yet met. Well, we're meeting one now. And that the Thais don't speak that language, although Blind Galan, who's obviously buddy with Karaspala, because both artists, both mad, makes sense. I get that. But, you know, point is that they don't speak that language, and there is power in words that we don't know. Obviously, that's like an old belief. And I like that idea that you have these hearthstones, which are obviously like always been very symbolic in every culture. You have that hearthstone in a new house, and only that family knows those words. We first see like the idea of the Azathanese script at the beginning with "There will be peace" written on Draconis' door. And then we see it again in with Krill. And just like the way it's introduced, like so we learn about that whole idea with those secret words. We learn that through Krill in that house, Krill Durav at that house, and then we come to the point where that first stone is placed, that new house that Anderist is building for his wife, and it is Anamander Rake who got that thing, and then we see the builder of the Azathani, and he comes across as something of a jerk, but also very honest and all that. I like that, and the idea that like you paid for with money, you just paid for the transportation, and you need to vow and so forth to make that blood vow, and then Anamandaric forces him to also make the blood vow, and afterwards asks his name because Anamandaric is not a smart person sometimes, and then we obviously learn at the end that that person is Caladan Brood. So I'm not going to speculate about the fact that in Memories of Ice it is said that he has Barghast blood, so I'm not going to speculate on that one. But so yeah, we see how far back the that brotherhood between Anamander and Caladan Brood goes and how it started. So I love that fact because it's like, yeah, they not just, you know, met and said like, you know what, that's pretty cool. We're bros from now on. That's not how that works. No, both were dickheads and forced each other to do dumb things, and suddenly they are linked by blood. And that's how it works. Which also makes sense when you see later on in Memories of Ice, mostly Memories of Ice, but also already in Gardens of the Moon, that there's always some kind of tension between the two. Like they're linked, but there is tension there because it's not just best friends kind of thing. So yeah, there's that. And I've probably missed a lot of things in those two chapters, but yeah, we're gonna go back now and read the next couple of chapters and talk about them. Ideally, this evening when it's cool enough for my camera not to overheat, because that's dumb. And then we'll see where this is going. Until then, cheers.